I'm Chad Jackson, the CEO and Chief Analyst at Lifecycle Insights. Our research is showing us that the biggest challenges with engineering transformation isn't technology-focused. It's actually people-centered and resistance-oriented. We believe that today's change agents need more than just a project plan. They need research, classes, organizational assessments, and role-based insights. We're starting an early access program called the Founders Council, where we collaborate with partners to upskill and enable change agents. If that seems like a fit, book a meeting with me at lifecycleinsights.com. And now, on to the show. Marilyn Arceo, thanks for joining the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I'm really excited to talk to you. You know, someone that's kind of focused more on the software side of things, especially in the context of complex hardware and software systems. So I'm looking forward to it. A good place to start is to kind of understand how you got to this point in your career. Like, what was your path? What was your journey that got you into this kind of role? And what are you doing right now?
Yeah, so just a little bit of myself. I currently work in the aerospace and defense industry. Sitting in the corporate office, enterprise architect, and I focus on digital manufacturing initiatives. So just kind of like day to day, I just shape how like software and data and digital manufacturing just how they sit together and how can we go faster and operate more efficiently. My background is actually in software engineering and data engineering. Got my computer science degree. I pretty much mostly spent doing a lot of like innovative or experimental like projects, and a lot of it was around like data or automation or some sort of operation. But I worked across all these different industries from like I would say CPG, fashion, healthcare, commercial real estate, e-com. I even did like a stint in logistics as one of my internships. So I've kind of seen like how every single sector has tried to modernize like their business. And so, I didn't really like set out to be an architect. I kind of just kind of went in there, and then I just like problem solving. So that's kind of how I ended up here.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. You know, usually with these highly technical roles like this and in really complex industries, you almost have to like scheme to get into the kind of role that you're in. So that's a really cool career path that got you there.
Yeah, it's super unique. And I always tell everybody that like definitely do stints in commercial, do stints in like defense or, these like highly regulated systems because it makes you think outside the box. So makes you a better engineer overall.
Cool. I love it. I love it. Um, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about change agents. So, just as a baseline, I'd love to get your perspective on how do you define a change agent? What do they do? What role do they play? Would love to get your perspective there.
For me, I think like so my definition of a change agent is I would say that someone who helps like an organization like move from like the old to the new and kind of like the technology, but the change management portion of it, like the people portion of it. So I used to call them throughout my career my power users and these like, and the departments, but it's basically the person that's kind of connecting the people and the processes and all the tools so they can like champion and make sure that the technology is adoptable.
Cool. I like it. So, I like that definition. So, given that definition, are you actually a change agent?
I would like to believe that I am just because I'm the type of person that is like, I love to learn about what people do before I implement anything. And so I get to know what problem I'm solving and the people who I'm working with and try to have that collaborative relationship with them. So I would consider myself a
Okay, gotcha. Understood. Um, you know, what we find in a lot of these episodes, these interviews, is that people consider themselves change agent, but it's rarely in officially in their title. It's an additional set of responsibilities that is separate from their official role, and it's kind of on top of everything else. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like in your career journey and how you got to be in production, you know, when you're working with AI and software, like formal components. Uh, what about this informal component of your role? Tell me, how did you get to become a change agent?
I think for me, I would even say like from my schooling, my computer science advisor at the time was like, our job as computer scientists is to make people's lives easier. So I've always had this mentality that we're not here to replace, we're here to just make things easier. So I've kind of always taken that role in just every single part of my career, whether it's in academia or in, like the commercial world and all that kind of good stuff. But for me, I always try to break down like the problem and the people aspect of it and then like incorporate it into anything that I'm doing in the technology world because I always say I'm like I've seen it happen where engineers are building these like, technology platforms or whatever it is, right? And they fail because they are missing the mark on the problem. So it's something that I kind of took responsibility in my career where I just like, let me just make sure I'm doing this because it helps me build out the best product and it's going to be adoptable term.
Cool. That's great. And I think that makes a ton of sense. There's a lot of people that listen to this podcast that may be aspiring change agents. Um, for them, I'd love to hear from you about what really contributes to success. What are the factors or traits of a change agent that contribute to success?
I would say that the ability to think outside the box, but being a bit of a go-getter and going beyond the norm, right? Where if you see something that is, it's like getting out of like that, if it's not broken, don't fix it mentality, if you see something where you can optimize or you see a problem that you can just be like, oh, if you just tweaked it a little bit, right? And like almost like that tinkering, I think those are the traits where you're trying to figure out like, hey, this is actually like if we do these little, adjustments, then uh, just we can probably go a little bit faster, right? Or we could, save up some time. So I would say like, you know, being being a person that's kind of like very like, a go-getter, thinking outside of the box, but also being practical and being able to like talk to like your coworkers and like your team members and just also like key in my opinion, be collaborative because the teams that you're working with are always going to be tech teams or might be like business folk. So being able and also like communication. So I think if you're a really good communicator, I think you'll get your message across and the problem you're trying to solve easy.
That's great. And you seem like a people person. And it seems like we could jump in and have a conversation like that pretty easily. And I think that's a big component too.
I would say so, yeah, and I think, like, the soft skills are pretty key, I would think, just because I think everyone really focuses on the technical, but if you're not able to communicate your problem or your solution or whatever it is, I think it gets lost in translation, and then, uh, whatever it is that you're doing is unsuccessful.
I think that's a really good observation. That's really astute. And with respect to that, you talked about the technical aspect of a solution, the people side of things. Notice with a lot of change agents in engineering that they gravitate more towards the technical side of things than the people side of things. It's almost like a comfort area, a place that they know really, really well. And they don't gravitate typically, and maybe this is changing with generations too. So I'd love your perspective on this. They don't traditionally, they haven't gravitated as much towards the people side of things. So, like, you gotta go out there and talk to people and see what's going on and what are the problems and what can we solve. Um, can you talk about that dynamic a little bit and where people where are they falling in this change agent role?
I would say that a lot of times in my career, I've seen people will fall in really, really technical or really people side. And like there isn't a lot of like in between. So you don't really have like those business translators. And so like I remember my first job, we had something called like an IT relationship manager. And those were the people that were bridging the gap between like the business and then like the technical people. And so like I think I learned very like really early on that like, okay, we need to talk to both sides, right? But I'm seeing like now there's a little bit of a shift now. I would say lately, I would say people who are very passionate about like the technology will be kind of like in between, but and not a lot of them. And I've kind of just noticed that.
The resistance paradox: why successful transformations don't avoid friction, they navigate it. That's our latest research report. It delves into how practically every organization encounters moderate or greater resistance, but the ones that navigate that well with change agents encounter more success. You can get a copy at lifecycleinsights.com. Come, check it out. Let us know what you think. It'd be great to have feedback. And now, back to the show. That's a great point. And, for a listener or viewer, this might be a good opportunity. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about like what kind of, people go into different roles for different reasons, right? And one of those is they want to accelerate their career. And sometimes these change agents can get more visibility with executives, right? So, okay, so I want you to lead this initiative, and I want you to succeed. And if you succeed, then hey, lo and behold, you're advancing. Can you talk about that a little bit? What's a dynamic here that you've seen with executives and visibility?
I would say like throughout my career, I think the people who are champion change, like these change agents, yeah, they do get a seat at the table most times. It just depends on how like the company dynamic is and how they kind of set those up, if they're formal or informal and whatnot. Um, I've seen in the past that like people like some of these change agents can, do these executive level like presentations. They can meet with the board. Like I've seen it at like my old startup and all that kind of stuff. And they do get to see at the table. Some do get promotions or they get like higher, I would say like high impact projects because they kind of shown like, hey, this is what I did like on the side. And then I championed this. And then now they're kind of getting that opportunity to kind of expand what they're kind of passionate about. So I've seen people kind of go into this funnel of like, okay, you know, they'll get a little bit more opportunities and whatnot, but it just depends how the organization is just like set out.
That's really good. Yeah, that's really insightful. So, last question on this front. What do you feel is the most compelling or fulfilling or satisfying thing about being a change agent, in that type of role? What do you enjoy the most?
I think for myself is actually seeing the impact that whatever it is that I'm implementing is actually like positively impacting the people that it is, it's serving at that point, right? I always do it for the people. And then again, like my whole thing is like you were supposed to make people's lives easier, not harder. So like I always kind of I tell people like when we're developing something, I'm like, if we're adding more processes or more constraints onto whatever it is that we're doing, we're building it wrong. And so for me, I love seeing that like it's successful, people are adopting it, and they're like, how do we do more or how do we scale it to across the board?
Great. All right, cool. Good. Excellent. So, let's shift gears again. Talked about change agents there for a little while. I'd like to talk a little bit about software engineering, and you mentioned that obviously that's the space that you're working on. Some data stuff from a manufacturing perspective so far in your career, and I'd like to understand. Are you walking into an organization that kind of already has an established software engineering competency? So, like, is there a structure, roles, all that kind of stuff, or is it kind of like part of a group that's establishing a new competency?
Depending on the role, but I would say it's like a mixed bag. It's like half and half. I've walked in where they have the software competency, like from a traditional point of view, they have, like an IT operations, right? But then when we're talking more on the innovative side, the software engineers or the data engineers and all those roles exist, but not in like the manufacturing world, I would per se, right? Or, even when I was working in healthcare, it was like they were kind of there, but they weren't. So we're trailblazing a little bit and building that structure and that processes to make sure, hey, are we cyber compliant? Like, or, the HIPAA compliance and all that kind of stuff. Or, like I remember when I was working at my startup at Soylent and GDPR just came on. I'm like, okay, we got to go do that. So how do we figure that out? We have, customers in the EU. So it's definitely would say like a mixed bag of that. But yeah, it kind of exists, but it doesn't.
Yeah, okay, all right. It makes sense. Well, I mean, that sounds really fun to be able to go in and like establish DevOps in an organization that's never had it before. I'm sure that had to be different. Um, and I would be curious. I'm curious to understand, like, what are the big stumbling blocks or challenges from that front, establishing that, or what surprised you along the way?
I would say like in my career when we're talking like for example the DevOps example you just said, right? You know, if you're an established like company that has software engineering, not all the times they understand wh- what the concept is or like your leadership understands that, right? And so I think communication is clarity and it's super key. And so sometimes I also think that we have to do a little bit of marketing almost, like, and a lot of education of, like, so what's the standard, development life cycle? What does that mean for us? How does it benefit us? Or why would we need DevOps? Like, why should we have everything on Docker, right? Right, and so, like and I remember, like, my second job was, like, they came in and I was like, "Okay, well, like, everything's on Docker." I didn't know what DevOps was, but my VP at the time was a DevOps engineer. He's like, "We need this, and we already have this set up." And so, um, it it's been kind of interesting to just be, like, part of the front of where, like, we have to continually, like, educate everybody from, like, lower level to the top level to understand, like, why you need all these things. And I think you tell the people the why, and then, like, the benefits of everything, like, go, "Oh, it's a little bit smoother," but, like, again, like, it's still gonna be a little bit of a battle because, like, everyone has budgets and, software costs are really expensive or AWS gets really expensive too, so
Gotcha. Okay, makes sense. Um, Another thing I'd like to dig into is staffing. And, since this was kind of a new competency, how was it staffed? Did you bring in experienced software engineers from other organizations? Did you hire people from internally? Did you bring in folks directly out of school? Would love to get that perspective.
yeah, like, I can say from across, like, 3 or 4 jobs, like, oof, I like, my healthcare job, we didn't have, like, data people at all, and so I was their first data engineer. Yeah, and then we had a data analyst, and then we had our data scientist, like, that was my boss at the time, and so we kind of, like, had, like, the full stock a little bit, and then we also had, like, software engineers, like, on our team, but, we were hiring people right out of college, some people that are experienced like myself at the time, and then people are, like, super senior, so we really had a mixed bag. I've had an instance where I've converted people who were, like, system engineers or mechanical engineers and stuff to learn how to code because even like electrical engineers, I realized, they had took a lot of like software engineering classes in their courses, so they know how to code. So if I can convert them and then give them that like, hey, that leg up of like, here's a new skill, right? And people are really excited. So like again, it's kind of like an uphill battle, but I would say, like, having the proper processes in place, like, oh, how do you put stuff in, like, GitHub? And, like, how do you set up your repository? How are we gonna code? Like, it's been kind of fun because, I think I would say it's just because it's, like, it's not boring, and I think for me, I don't like the boring. I don't like the, like, just, like yeah.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I mean, there are some personalities that like to continuously trailblaze or be a pioneer. like to kind of be on that frontier and doing new things all the time. Some other people like to have the status quo, and establish this is how we do things. Neither is right or wrong, but yeah.
Yeah, and I would say that, what's it called? I think, like, I would say that, like, some of the engineers kind of crave something new, and how I see it too is that, like, so many senior software engineers teach me, like, so many different things, and I'm doing a disservice to my community and my software engineering community, data community for not teaching my junior engineers or anybody. And so I need to leave the place better than how I left it, right? And so that's kind of me like just pushing everybody forward. Like I want every engineer that I mentor or I train to be better than I am long term.
Yeah, I love that. I love that perspective and attitude. If everybody was more like that, we wouldn't have a problem in the world, would we? Can you talk? So let's continue in that. Can you talk a little bit about infrastructure and obviously the software? A lot of people use Agile. Was that there? Was it established? Did you have to get that in place?
Yeah, I would say so. Like my first couple of jobs, it was kind of in place, a little informally, but we did like an agile Kanban situation, but a lot like later on in my career, it wasn't in place. So then that's kind of like where I was like, okay, so I learned, back when Azure DevOps was Azure DevOps, and it was T Foundation server. Like I remember like, okay, so what are we gonna do now? Like how are we gonna, execute our, project plan or our tasks and all that kind of stuff. So like how do I bring the process in? And it's like, bringing the team along and do it iteratively because I think we overwhelm people if we say we're gonna do agile 100%. We're gonna use like Asana or whatever it is, right? And Trello, and you're like, this is just too overwhelming for me. Like, so being able to put things in bite-sized pieces and also working with your team to understand that like what they should be doing, how we should be doing it, and how do we like incorporate like some of like these agile ceremonies I think is super key because you also need their buy-in. And like we can't be like, let's just change everything to a 180. It's kind of like that change management stuff again. It's like you can't, just pressure people to do something.
That's really good. That's good advice. We provide a lot of guidance for organizations that look at these initiatives, and we think about it on two fronts. One is value. What's the value to the organization that you could realize, at least theoretically, if you haven't done it yet. And the other is risk. So if you want to go and do that, what's the risk that you don't achieve that value in your ongoing operations? So how have you seen that play out? Have you seen organizations kind of look at it through those two lenses? Have you seen disruption? Any stories you could share? Any lessons learned? I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, like definitely people do see things on like, are it depends on like where you're at, right? Some people are gonna be less risk adverse and some people are going to be more like, I'm willing to take the plunge because we gotta, right? Um, I've definitely seen people see it in through those lenses, but I've seen people take things in a conservative route where like I would say like my second job where we were pushing boundaries and we were big risk takers up until like a org change and they made us risk adverse. And so we had actually built out our e-commerce platform, homegrown Python, Django, the whole thing, right? And and I would say like we were one of the first few companies that did that whole subscription model. And I remember Dollar Shave Club was like doing the same thing. And so um we ended up going into, a Shopify website later on, and it completely changed like our whole infrastructure and we lost autonomy because I think that, our reorg was a little bit like, they're a little risk adverse with their, the engineering side. So they're like, we want something stable. And I'm like, well, we do have something stable, but, so, you know, I've seen some things where I think sometimes you need to take the plunge a little bit, do a little bit of research. I think if you're not willing to, do some things because it seems a little scary. Just do the research. If like the math isn't mathing, that's why I tell people, right? Then like then don't do it. But if it's low hanging fruit, and I hate using that term, right? Or the high impact or and low cost, go for it. Because at the end of the day, what's the worst that can happen if it's like a code change? You test it, you see if it works out, you do an MVP, right? If it's not working out, you don't have to roll it out. You just do a small investment and then see how it works out.
It's a really good perspective. That's great advice. Um, and then, there's this concept in more traditional engineering side of things, like around fast track change to full track change. So, fast track if it's a low cost, low impact person in the front of the line, figure it out. Give them some autonomy and choices. And if it's a big impact, big cost, then okay, it requires more scrutiny. It should go through a lot of due diligence, get buy-in, go in front of a change advisory board. I think aligns with some of what you're saying here, and I think that's good. Lets people, get some autonomy. So, boy, next up, I'd love to get your perspective on AI and helping coding. Would love to kind of get your perspective on what's going on, if there's value there, if there's risk there. How are you seeing that?
It's a mixed bag, but I'm probably gonna say something very unpopular. It's risky. Um, and I say this just because I think like the data that's going in to these LLMs and these and it's the thing is they're all LLMs. And I did a talk about this last year at a conference and where I talk about data governance, and it's garbage in, garbage out. And the thing is, like, if you're inputting garbage into your model and it's outputting garbage, right? And I have seen, people not really check what these code assistants are doing and they're like trusting. I'm like, but it's gonna be a little bit dangerous. But I think as long as that you have some sort of human in the loop intervention and there's like a code review and you're optimizing the code that the AI, coding assistant's doing, I think you're fine. I think it's helping people speed up like all the processes. You're not having to spend so much time doing some of the stuff. You could spend more time doing architecture work and then less time coding like all the lower hanging stuff. But again, like as long as there's a human in the loop, I'm pretty good with it. But again, I think like some people are gonna like cut corners. I mean, some people will do it. Like, let's be truthful here, and they're gonna just trust it blindly. And that's where I think it gets a little dangerous. And you're pushing out production code that's either, computationally heavy and it's like breaking stuff, and then read code debugging.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think that makes a ton of sense. It's so funny. I've seen conflicting statistical findings around AI and coding. On one side, they say it can make you 40 to 60% faster. On the other side, it says, yeah, it can make you 20% slower because you got to go back and fix the slop. So what do you think is the key? Okay, if you're going to use AI, what are the skills that you need to pick up to make sure that you're successful there? Any guidance on that front?
So I think really good architecture work, right? And figure out what you're designing first before you start like using your code assistant. I think that's going to be really key because again, the coding assistant is freeing the engineers so that they can design and problem solve, right? And that's like get your draft out, get your pseudocode out, right? I'm not asking anybody to code the whole thing, but um be aware of how if you have coding guidelines, right? Like if you have Python, people were doing like PEP 8, and all that kind of good stuff. Like make sure you're refactoring code or doing everything that it's abiding to your, software engineering like rules and your standards. But kind of figure out again, like code reviews. I would say that would be really like I would say mandatory at that point. And then Also, like, if you're using like a chatbot, right, like Claude or something like that, or OpenAI's ChatGPT, like make sure what are you inputting isn't like sensitive. Because if you don't have an enterprise, agreement or your own hosted LLM on site and any of that kind of stuff, you need to figure out what can or cannot be shared. And then just check for your common errors, any logical flaws, anything security wise. I think that because again, like these LLMs can hallucinate. And so that just kind of figure out like if that doesn't look right, then just double check it.
Yeah, then it's probably not right. Yeah, okay. All right. Um, that's good. Good perspective. And I think that's good advice. What do you think about this from a cybersecurity perspective? We've talked a lot about different scenarios so far in this conversation. Talked about e-commerce, production environment. I find it pretty interesting when we've talked with those folks, these kind of systems for production environments. And boy, cybersecurity is like tip top in the list of concerns because you could be shut down. You could have it infect your network. You could shut down the plant, and really, really scary stuff. What have you seen from a cybersecurity perspective? What's the spectrum of awareness of the problem and being completely conservative or being somewhat progressive around that?
I think I've seen it in like I would say some are conservative, some are progressive. I think a lot of the time from my experience, as long as you keep cyber in the loop and you're going through, and you have them in the beginning, right? Like, so I tell people cybersecurity engineers and the cybersecurity department isn't scary. So if if you're going to build a project and you're probably gonna have to do some firewall stuff or whatever it is, or you're gonna, do some open source stuff and you're like working in healthcare, right? And like, want to have a data breach in the beginning of your, project. And and the thing is, you work with them through like requirements on like, okay, so if we're like, if you're in defense, you have to, know, you have to basically, make sure you're compliant to all these other standards depending on like the level. And if you're healthcare, you have this other set. And then if you're in finance, that's kind of like a whole other thing as well. So I think understanding what the requirements are from a cybersecurity perspective, right? And figuring out like from the get-go, like what is it that we have to do to make sure that we're able to deploy this, right? And like if it's something that's AI, and have them check it, right? A lot of the times, like, they're happy to do these things. I'm not even like all the cyber people I worked with, they're so happy to like be involved from the beginning. And, some are like, hey, this isn't good. Like, we found this, we found that, or, you can use this as long as like, X, Y, Z, and we do all these other things. So again, it's pretty reasonable, but people are pretty progressive right now, I would say, for the most part, just because I think AI has been like, I think it's that new data science, right? It's like that new big thing. And so I think a lot of people are embracing it. And so I think it's been all right.
All right, I think that's good advice. Yeah, I think that's good guidance. Um, and next up, I'd like to talk about hardware software integration. And I've seen in product development, boy, companies really struggle with this, right? I mean, they're twisting themselves in knots trying to figure out that integration. Identify and expose issues early and resolve them early. And the same thing with production environments too, right? I mean, getting your automation, getting your OT to actually execute programming flawlessly is very, very hard. Can you talk to me a little bit about those challenges, what you've seen and what you've experienced?
I would say in general, like one of the big issues I've seen when you were talking about like, hardware and software integrations and all that kind of good stuff is that not everyone's on the same page or in the same room. And so everyone's working in some sort of silo. And so like I always they're doing the whole throwing it over the fence situation. And so I honestly have seen that like big step that we've done like in the industry is like how do we get everybody in the same room, right? And then, instead of just throwing it over the wall, right? And so how do we, make sure that we're like Are we sharing the same type of architecture? Are the goals the same? Are we doing the thing that we need to be doing? So like if we're doing integrations, right? Like sh- we have all the right players in the room, right? So we can talk about all of this. So I think that's kind of like the first thing that like I've seen the challenges are, or like getting everybody in the same room and then agreeing like, okay, this is what we're gonna do. And meeting in the middle, because I think there's a lot of negotiation too, because they're like, "Well, I want this," and you're like, "Well, I want that. We can't do this." Like, so what's the middle? What can we do?
And do you see that formalized kind of like with agile team structures? Is it something else? Like, is there any kind of structure in how a company could solve that challenge?
I would say, I personally do a lot of agile. Like, I do like a mix of like agile slash waterfall because some people hate the like I really don't like agile, and so I'm like, how do I rebrand agile to not be agile? So, and then how do I make them feel a little more comfortable on how we're structuring like the project or the whatever it is? So I usually try to do some agile, practices. I communicate a lot, and then I set up a lot of like working sessions where I'm like, how do we get together and like problem solve this whole thing, right? Can we agree on these set of requirements? And then this is what exactly what we're doing. And then getting everybody on a seat at the table. 'Cause I think a lot of times not everyone gets to see at the table. So opening it back up, I think, and then just allowing everybody to contribute has been pretty successful.
All right, cool. Yeah, that's good. That's good. Um, Another thing from Agile I'd like to explore with you is this concept of frequent prototypes at the end of a sprint, and actually having a working prototype actually working. Is that a practice that you've seen adopted with any success, especially in production environments?
I would say like in other organizations, in other companies, I've seen it be like super successful that we would have like we had a full like software development life cycle. So we have like our, dev staging and prod situation. So like everything that we had built would go into staging and then it go into testing before we hit prod. So I thought that was very successful. I would say with, organizations that don't have that practice, like embedded, and that's something that they live and breathe. Um, we're getting in the practice of like, okay, what did you do and like what kind of artifact, right? So even if it's not a working prototype and let's say it's something else, right? Sharing that out, getting like a peer review, right? That has been super helpful.
All right. Okay. Makes sense. Makes sense. That's all really good guidance. So, last couple of questions. Let's talk about signals from management. So, if you were giving advice to, a change agent being asked to build out a software engineering competency, what are good signals that you can get from executives like that? Um, and that this is going to be a situation where you're set up for success. What are bad signals that this may not work out there? Would love to get your perspective.
Um, I would say that if leadership is really like open to understanding what the software competency is, just because, in the case that you may have a non-technical, leader, um, and they're open to what that actually means and what the software needs are, right? And they're willing to invest beyond like the one-off projects. That's a really good sign, right? And then they're I would say driving down the culture from the top down that this is what we have to be doing, right? Like we're going to adopt this. We're going to do this, through iteration, right? We're gonna learn, we're gonna make mistakes. It's okay to fail, right? And I think once you have that sort of like open like culture and that type of like environment, I think that's where people are a little bit more successful, right? When they try to adopt something like that. I would probably those are the green flags, right? Because they're kind of the ones that are like, okay, we're gonna do this, but like we also know that it's gonna be a little bumpy along the way, right? I think when you're looking at something a little bit more, I would say like, setting up for failure kind of situation, I think the unwillingness to invest into technology or invest into foundational technology, right? So I always tell people, like, for the example with AI, I tell them, like, well, if you're investing in AI, I'm like, how's your data infrastructure? Right. And so, like, if you're not like, if you're seeing like they're not investing in infrastructure for scalability and they're doing like one-off projects just to kind of say that they did the thing, I think that's a big red flag because it's not like their willingness to invest for the future and the scalability. And then if they're pressuring the change agents and I would say the individual contributor levers level to do all the change and do all the culture change by themselves, it's a little bit of a red flag for me and just from my experience, because you're not getting that leadership support, and that's really what you want at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, that's all good guidance for potential change agents looking at opportunities right now. This is good guidance to kind of take into account uh, if you're going to be in a good situation or not a good situation. Um, all right, last question. If you could redesign anything in the world and make it better, talk about the better mousetrap, what would it be? Anything.
I would say your transportation system, like public transportation train systems, I would probably redesign that whole thing. Yeah, that's what I would probably do. Transportation and our public transportation and like trains. As weird as it sounds, but like what I would redesign.
Well, maybe you'll get to be able to work on that project one day. Maybe we'll get funding for that. I think that would be pretty great and pretty awesome. Well, cool. Marilyn, thank you so much for your time today, for joining. This has been very insightful. Really appreciate all your insights.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me.
This is Chad again. Thanks for listening to the show. In these episodes, lots of discussion online, and maybe even your company. Hopefully you're hearing the same thing that we're hearing. The biggest challenge to engineering transformation isn't technology focused. It's actually people centered. As part of the Founders Council, we're developing research, training, organizational assessments, and insights to upskill and enable change agents. That sounds like where you need to be. Come book a meeting with me at lifecycleinsights.com. Take care and talk soon.